of you haven't already met him, can I introduce Adrian Cole, please?
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Adrian a few questions first, then we're going to throw it open to you lot to ask him some questions, because I'm feeling lazy this afternoon. Adrian, you wrote a trilogy some time ago called Dream Lords.
Yes.
What happened to that?
All copies were taken off the shelves and burned. No, that was my very first effort. I wrote it. I don't know how many years ago, a long time ago.
1976.
Yes. Well, actually, I started writing it. It took me about 4 years to get to a completed version. It started off as a one-off novel, which was originally going to be called The Barbarians. And I filled up about 7 or 8 exercise books for this novel over a period of about 2 years or so. And then eventually, sent it off to an agent in the States because it was when I first started writing. And he sent it back to me and said, it needs rewriting and retyping because I've got some interest in it. And to cut a long story short, it went through about 3 or 4 rewrites and ended up as a trilogy with zero paperbacks. They gave me the worst covers in the history of science fiction and fantasy publishing, I think. Then they reprinted them, and on the reprints they managed to get the second volume, was entitled Volume 3, didn't do the sales figures too much good. It just sort of bombed, basically. It got me into writing. I mean, I was written with plenty of fervour and passion because it was my first work, whether it'll ever get reprinted, I wouldn't like to say. Possibly not.
Will you ever rewrite it?
Well, I don't know. I think if it was going to be reprinted again, I'd probably like to do a little bit to it, just to tidy it up. Possibly turn it into one fat book or something.
So after that was the Armadacon. How did you get started on that? How soon after the first?
Well, there's quite a big gap between the two series because I also wrote, which you obviously haven't unearthed yet, but will no doubt. I also wrote 4 science fiction novels for Robert Hale, which is pretty usually the death knell of any writer to do that. I wrote 2 sort of semi-Quatermass novels. One was called Madness Emerging, and the other was called Path in Darkness. And I also wrote a sort of Games World type, gladiatorial Games World, tongue-in-cheek spoof called War Gods of Ludorbis, Latin Games World, this really clever stuff. Also Bond. And I used to get a £200 advance from Robert Hale for writing these epics, you see, and that was about half of what I was getting for short stories with a magazine which will remain nameless, for whom I also wrote a number of science fiction comedy spoofs. And the last one I did for Hale was called The Lucifer Experiment, which was about a computer called Lucifer. That's what I'm going to tell you about that. Although it did have the dubious distinction of being the very last book published by Readers' Union Science Fiction Book Club, which then went bust. It had something to do with it. And then I was writing short stories, and I was doing a lot of sort of sword and sorcery, come dark fantasy fusions and things. You see what I mean? And the next actual book that I wrote was a book called Moorstones, which was based on a short story that I'd written for an American collection, and that was a novel set on Dartmoor. And it's been sort of billed as a children's book, although it's sort of young adults, come adults, And I did another one called Sleep of Giants after that, and Omara came after those. Omara came about in a strange way because like most struggling writers, I was starving. Well, not starving, literally starving, but I did have 2 cents to rub together. And Moorstones and Sleep of Giants have been published published in hardback by a local Devon publisher. And I went I was asked to go to do some talks to children, a children's book week, and the theme was dragons, and it was in Manchester. And one of the people involved in the book week in Manchester had been involved with my publisher of Moorstones, and they said, would you like to come up for a few days and talk to various groups of people about your books, children about your books, go to some schools, look, pay all the expenses in the park. And I said, yeah, fine. And on my way to Manchester, I went by train, and my train got into Birmingham a bit late, and I missed the connection to Manchester, and I had a 2-hour wait for the next train. And being in the centre of Birmingham, a friend of mine got a shop called Andromeda, which you may have heard of, or you've been to, a science fiction fantasy specialist, So I thought, good way to kill 2 hours would be to pop down to Andromeda. So I went along, and one of my friends up there said, oh, you're coming up next weekend to Birmingham because it's the fantasy convention, which I nearly always attended, but being broke, I said, well, I don't think I'm going to be able to afford to come, And he said, well, you ought to come really, because there are going to be a number of publishers coming this year who are looking for new writers of fantasy in particular. He said, you might have an opportunity of selling your Moorstones to Sleepy Giants to a paperback house, you see. So I said, well, I must make every effort to get up here. But I was thinking, what am I going to sell? What bit of furniture have I got at home I can sell to get to this convention thing and not have a ride on the hands of the family? But when I got to Manchester, one of the gigs, if you like, that I did was this very, very posh girls' school. And I was met by this charming lady called Miss Mullinger, who was the head of the English department, and she was a dead ringer from Margaret Rutherford, the old actress. And she was wonderful, and she treated me like Myson, because they looked after me very well. And she said, we were originally going to have a talk for talking to 50 of the girls, but in actual fact there are 100. When we said we have an author coming, there were 175 of them who showed an interest. I suspected that something to do with it was the fact that I was a man. Anyway, she said, well, we couldn't get all 175 of them into the library, but we managed to halve it, so we got about 80 or 90 of them. So anyway, I got to this library, and it was literally festooned with bodies. All the presses were all covered, and there they all were. And it really was a bit like St. Trinian's, although it was more orderly. And the staff sat down the side, on line, about 6 of them. Wow. Anyway, I did my piece, and fortunately it was okay. We talked about books and writing, and they were genuinely interested. And I had quite a nice day with them. And to get to the point of the story at last, I said, we've enjoyed it very much. Is there any way you could get back again to do the other 90 girls? And I said, well, I could actually I could probably get up here next Friday and do an afternoon piece and shoot back to Birmingham. So that's what happened. They paid for my expenses, obviously, to go to Manchester, which enabled me to whip down to Birmingham afterwards and get to the con. And at that con, I was able to give Moorstones and Sleepy Giants to publishers who then became our publishers. They took them away and made them. They didn't actually take those because they weren't quite what they were after, but they asked me for an adult fantasy, so they'd be very interested. I wrote Place Among the Fallen, which was the first of the books, and off we went. So perhaps if I'd missed the train, things would have worked out the way they did.
Was that a design trilogy? Did you design it to
Not
be a
really,
trilogy
no.
that grew, or?
I was aware of the fact that these things were going on, but I wrote A Place Among the Fallen as one book. It was only when I was doing the final revisions on it that I thought some of the characters and some of the settings would be interesting to explore. And, because series were popular, I talked to my editor about it. She said, well, fine, if you'd like to do another couple of volumes, then we're interested. So I started writing what was supposed to be another 2 volumes, but by the time I got halfway through Throne of Fools, the second one, I realised that it was going to have to be 4 books, possibly 5. But it ended up as 4. And the second, third, and fourth are, I suppose, they follow on from each other in a more continuous way. I mean, it's all one story, but you could read the first volume as a book on its own. So yes, I mean, and the next series that I wrote after that, the Historical, was designed right from the word go as one big book, as a 4-volume book. It's not a quartet doesn't have to be. There's nothing mystical about 4, it's just the way they came out.
So who was going to be the original hero in Amara Saga?
Well, the idea was, I suppose, in a way, that Corbillion, I say alien, but I only say alien because he comes from a parallel world. He was the main character, and there were a number of other characters like Branagh, who was from the Amaran world. And I found that, you know, you find with characters when you get involved with them that they're a bit like an unruly collection of children. If you don't keep a grip on them, they all want to sort of rush off in all directions and tell their own stories. And some of the lesser characters sort of came to the fore and suggested plots, because my characters and plots are very, very interwoven. You know, they sort of, one spins off on the other. Simon Wargallow, who starts off as a very dark and seemingly evil character, or unpleasant character, was intended to be a major character in Place Among the Fallen, but that was probably going to be, you know, as far as he was going to go in the series. But I became so intrigued by this character, and the fact that his particular dilemma is that the almost fanatical anti-religion which he's been brought up on, he discovers during the course of the book that it's all a lie. Everything he's been taught is wrong. The only way that he and the other characters can get themselves out of the impending disaster is by joining up, and he has to kind of rethink his philosophy. But he does it, and he never becomes the perfect gentleman or a good guy, but he swings from being what is potentially the bad side to the good side. And he became such an interesting character to me that he more or less took over the series and became the main character in the series. And the feedback that I get is that pretty well how people see him.
He wasn't planned that way in the beginning.
Well, no. I mean, I only planned, as I said, really the first book, and I hadn't thought of him beyond that particularly.
So how much did you actually plan? Was the whole of the first book actually planned out, or did that?
Some of the subplots evolved during the course of writing it, but the main idea of it, and the main themes were planned. I mean, all my stuff, because I usually use a fairly large canvas. I mean, if I was an artist, I'd want the whole wall to do my painting on. You know, that's the way I work with lots of places and characters and that. And because of that, I have to plan out quite carefully beforehand. I bring in new characters and new incidents and things, but the bones of it is quite well structured before I start. And it was so in the Place Among the Fallen.
The Star Requiem was planned right from the beginning.
Yes, that was the first work that I sold before I'd written it. I got a contract for the series. I did a detailed synopsis of the overall saga, and then I did an individual 7 or 8 page synopsis of the first volume. And then I went away and wrote the first volume. And when I submitted that, I actually submitted also a 7 or 8 synopsis of the second volume. I couldn't have written a detailed synopsis of each volume at the start, because they changed so much. By the time I'd written the first book, the bare bones were there for 2, 3 and 4, but the detail of it changed quite drastically as I was going along. So probably the last one was pretty well fixed.
You can't plan out exactly with a novel then how it's going to end. Well, you can
major events. I think major events you do, but I find I've tried to develop characters as I've gone on writing, and I find if your characters are strong, or if they're coming through, that they will themselves create plots for you, or subplots, because you're wondering what's going to happen. You know, they don't just sort of come on, say their piece and go off stage again. They want to, because there are always consequences to what they do or what they say. And sometimes it's just interesting to explore that. Sometimes you get in a curious situation, I know other writers have been the same, where you have a certain bit of dialogue or a bit of plot or a prop or something which you can't really think why it's in there. You just like the feel of it as you're doing it in your draft, and you think, well, I may have to come back and exercise that altogether later on. But by the time you get 6 or 7 chapters on, you're doing something and you suddenly think, yes, I see now why I put that personal bit in that earlier chapter. This is where it ties in. And it's a strange thing, because it's sort of intuition that tells you don't cut it. But really, at the time, it doesn't have that strong a bearing. You just like the feel of it, and then it's suddenly it makes sense.
O'Mara's selling in the States now with different covers.
That's right. Yeah.
Some British ones doing well.
Yes, the O'Mara series over here. It did reasonably well. It did an average sort of print over here, but in the States they released it last year, and it's just been reprinted. It's I haven't seen the final figures yet. I mean, they're due any time, but it's been reprinted, which can't be bad. So
when does Star Requiem come out?
that's the first one very soon, I think. Probably in the spring.
When are we going to see it proper paperback?
Over here. Yes. I mean, it's a problem. The publishers over here are tending to bring out a lot of these trade paperbacks now, these large editions, and they can be quite expensive. I think probably what they're doing is using them to, in many cases, replace what would have been a hardback edition. But because hardbacks are so expensive now, they're bringing the trades out, and then after a year or so, bringing them out in mass market. I was talking to my editor a week or two ago, and they were hoping to do all the Star Requiem next year, but it might even be spring 1993 by the time they get to it. They have a fairly short list now, because a lot of these people are contracting, but they haven't chopped it, but they've just put it back a bit. So maybe another year before it comes out.
Are you having any problems with the upheavals that have been in the publishing industry today?
Yes, because I was I won't say embittered, but I felt. What happened recently was that to go back a bit, in working with Unwin Hyman, who's now been bought by Collins, I worked very, very closely with the editor there, Jane Johnson, and Jane's, she's my idea of an ideal editor, and she reads my stuff carefully, she likes it, which is fine, but she also comments on it, and she doesn't make me rewrite great chunks of the book, but she might suggest the odd change, the odd bits and pieces here that might be doing better. And I've always taken that on board, because I think you're daft if you don't. They're only trying to bring the best out of you. And we've had a really good working relationship for about 7 years on the O'Mara books and on Star Requiem. And we talked about, while I was writing the last volumes of Star Requiem, we talked about the future, and she said, I think next time, now's the time to go for a big fantasy novel, break away. And she said, I know you want to break away from traditions, because I try not to, although I've written 2 quartets, they're not Tolkien. O'Mara, I hope, is not a Tolkien clone, and I hope Star Requiem is not a clone of anything else, because they're really pretty bizarre fusions of fantasy, horror, and everything else as well. And that's the way I'm moving. I'm moving towards writing fantasy, which is, as Terry was saying this morning, that there is a whole area to be explored. It's not so much coming up with something totally and utterly brand new. It's new treatments, new ways of looking at things, and there are writers trying to do that. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I said to Jane that what I want to do is write a breakaway novel, which it won't revolutionise fantasy, but it's going to be more like the sort of thing that I want to write, and not be obviously influenced by too many other things. And she said, well, that's good. I think now's the time to do it. She said, I think I can see that that's what you're working towards. So I wrote. I finished earlier this year a book called Blood Red Angel. I think the prelude is in the programme, and that's a fairly hefty, very dark fantasy novel, which is that much more different, strange from the other things that I've done. And Jane was very enthusiastic about it. She liked it very much, and was. She said, "I just got to take this to the committee." In the background was this takeover. Unwin Hyman had been bought by the Rupert Murdoch group. Collins had bought them, and a lot of the publishers' staff went down the tubes. There were writers who were cut, and all sorts of problems and worries about what was going to happen. Jane was retained to work with the new setup at Collins Grafton, and she particularly wanted to use Blood Red Angel, but regrettably the committee said no, we're only going for the big names, we're only going for the Arabian Feist and Johnny Wirtz and David Ames and so on and so forth. Unless this chap can sell X 100,000 copies, then I'm afraid we're going to say no. So she had the unpleasant job of writing to me saying, I loved it, but they don't want to use it. Well, too upset about it, because what pleased me most was the fact that she liked it, and I've got a lot of faith in her judgment. I thought, well, if she likes it, then hopefully somebody else will. So my agent said, yeah, okay, don't worry, it's fairly laid back, and I'll push on with other publishers and see what we can do. But what cheered me up was that about a week or two later, my American agent wrote to me and said, I've sold Blood Red Angel to a publisher over here for you. We've got a good deal on it, and he likes it as well. So that one's fixed and set to maybe want a bit of revision. So yeah, Collins Grafton are going to be doing Star Requiem, and they've confirmed that they want to do that. I mean, it might be ironic, but if that really did well for them, then no doubt they want to reprint Omara, and quite probably, might even be interested in Blood Red Angel if it has gone to another publisher. So, although I say I'm not worried, yeah, well, okay, there's always another publisher. You're not really sort of happy and settled until you've got a contract with another publisher. We've got a couple interested, so. So
it looks as though Blood Red Angel is going to come out later here then, on the back of the American publisher.
Yeah, I think I think what will happen probably is that it will be published in America. That will probably be '93, and then subsequently, all being well, it will trigger off somebody over here. So we may not get a publisher over here till then. I don't know.
So we're all going to have to smuggle them in from the States then.
Yeah. But it can be very frustrating. I mean, people tend to think once you've had several books published, A, that you're very rich, which is not true because we don't all break through the Terry house. Well, and B, that whatever you write automatically sells. I mean, I feel fairly confident that Blood Red Angel will sell over here because I think it's the sort of book which is right for the market. But financially, the market's a bit depressed. But there are other projects which might take off.
Has anybody on the floor got any questions? Adrian.
Yes. Yeah, did you find it at some point much easier to get published in America because of the area you're working? I mean, from what you've been saying, you'd looking to get that, but that is probably the case.
I think it's a darn sight harder now. I think getting into publishing here and in America is very, very hard for new writers, mainly because of the state of the market here. It's not mirrored in America, but it's definitely tougher than it was. I was a bit lucky with the first things that I wrote because there was an agent starting up in America called Kirby McCauley, who's gone on to become quite a famous agent, who, when he started up, was looking specifically for new English writers of horror and fantasy and science fiction. And he was, at that time, quite interested in publishing or taking on board anybody that stood any chance of being published. And he obviously saw some potential in what I'd done. And there were a number of us. There were about eight or nine of us over here. I think at the time he took on people like Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley started with Kirby over there, and one or two others. And he obviously did the hard sell bit for us. I think it's essential selling in America to have an agent. Over the course of time, I changed agents. I found it easier to sell in America the second time around with the Omaran books because I had them published over here then. I did have a British agent years ago, but I don't really think that at the time I was writing the Robert Hale stuff and the Dreamwall stuff that I was anywhere near. In fact, there was a time when I was beginning to wonder whether I really had it in me to write reasonably good imaginative fiction. But I mean, I stuck to it, and once I got more stones and Omara sorted out, then they opened the door a bit. So it's been a case of that was toing and froing between the two. I've used one to springboard the other. But certainly now, I think it would be very, very hard for any new writer to be published in the States. And it's easier to be published over here if you've been published in the States. It's a bit of a vicious circle.
So is it harder now to break in than it ever was?
I think so at the moment because a lot of publishers, as I've said with Collins, they really said we're only interested in the big names, the big sellers, which is dark because in a few years' time, a lot of those people will have passed on to the word processor in the skies. So where's the new generation of writers going to come from? But I know that a lot of the big publishers they get a tremendous number of submissions, and if it's not stuff that they've commissioned, they might not even read it. And the other vicious circle is that they say that it's easier to get published if you've got an agent, which it is, but it's not easy to get an agent unless you've had something published.
So it really is a question of plugging away.
Being more persistent than ever, yeah.
So what's going to happen to fantasy and science fiction if there are no new writers coming on? Because
Well,
they're all being discouraged.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I can't ever see. I think in the last 10 years, imaginative fiction has really sort of taken off. In some ways, there's been overkill, but I think it's reached a point now where it'll never die. It's really got itself established. And I agree entirely, again, with something Tony said this morning about the attitude of the literati, this strange kind of, it's weird, it's science fiction, it's fantasy, therefore it's not literature. I don't give a damn about that. I don't think that matters at all. I don't like, I wouldn't hold up poor craftsmanship or poor writing, but I mean, if something is entertaining, well written and entertaining, then that's fine. But I think there is a market. I think the main contributor. I keep hearing publishers saying and people saying, yes, of course it's a depressed market because we're having to close ranks and all the rest of that. But I think what's the biggest contributor is the cost of books. I think these £6.99 trade paperbacks and the huge cost of paperbacks is the main contributor. I think the reason people aren't buying as many books as they were 5 years ago is the cost of books. The proportionate, right, I mean, obviously they go up, but I think that there's been a disproportionate increase in the price of books. And I think if we got to a stage where we got sensible prices again, then you'd see the sales would go up. And as soon as the sales started going up, you'd find more openings for the new writers again, and the whole cycle would begin again. I'm optimistic. I don't think I'm being unrealistic. I think it will happen. It's just a case of weathering the storm for a year or two. It can't go on. Some people might argue that it does, but I don't know. I think there's too much interest and enthusiasm.
Anyone else?
Sorry, yeah, as a follow-up to that, do you think the net book agreement going will be the best way around that? Do you think that would be the answer?
One way, yes, I think so. I would hate to see. I suppose the danger in it is if that happens and we get book wars, some of the small shops and the small businesses might get pushed out altogether, and I'd really hate to see that. I think if we've been dominated by chains, all right, we gain in one way, and writers gain in sales and that, but the corner shop and that, I mean,
Well, their argument is that you get less books published in the end, wouldn't you? I mean, I don't know whether that's credible or not, but I mean, that seems to be the sort of defensive attitude to why that doesn't happen. But I agree, I think books are priced and that happening for a long time. I don't know what we can do about it.
I think another thing which seems to me to be a real growth industry, if you excuse the cliche, but that is the desktop publishing side of things, and it's becoming more and more accessible to people, to produce real good quality pamphlets, booklets, whatever. And I think more and more people will use that as a medium for publishing. Smaller distribution, perhaps. Distribution is always the problem with sales. I mean, it's, if you really want to sell a lot of books, you've got to get into the distribution chain. But I think desktop publishing is offering a lot of openings to people, and I applaud that. And I think that's another possible saviour of it.
You're having stories published, aren't you, in small press publications? You mentioned last year something about vampire motorcyclists.
The Revenge of the Heavy Metal Vampires.
That's I knew.
Yes, well, it was supposed to be a film that I was writing for Sam Raimi. That was a rumour that I started. Sam Raimi's never heard of it. I know. We've only made it done by now. He's probably hunting for it. No, what that was following on from the Vulgariad, which was also rumoured to be a 36-volume thing that I was writing, and I did the reading, the spoof reading. Each year I try and find a theme to do a spoof, and last year's spoof was the Revenge of the Heavy Metal Vampires, which I did at FantasyCon, and that was the send-up of all the splatter movies and Freddy and various other things. And last year and the previous year, the editor of Fear magazine, who I know, John Gilbert, he asked if he could use them in Fear, and I said fine with it. they get nice circulation, a bit of publicity, so I have sort of rewrote them because they're written obviously to be performed, so there are certain gimmicks in there which are difficult to put on paper. So the Vulgarian appeared in Fear a couple of years ago, and the Revenge of Heavy Metal Vampires was in Fear last year. And if Fear doesn't fold, there's a rumour going around that it's about to, that Newsfield are going to go bust, although John Gilbert might keep it going, I don't know. Then hopefully Totally Terminal Alien Robo Predator will appear as well. I hope so, because he plays very well for us.
With the chest burster. Actually, where did you get the green sock? I was asked to ask you that.
My son doesn't know it yet, but it's one of his football socks. But there is a hole in it, so in my defence I should say, well, it was about to pack up anyway.
Any more questions from the floor?
What differences are there between the British and the American market? What's this type of book?
In terms of sales, or in terms
in terms of actually writing, do you think in writing for the American market, therefore include this or do it in this way?
Well, for for something like Omara or Star Requiem or Blood Red Angel, those sort of books, it doesn't really cross my mind at all. I don't really have to play around with the language and that. Because what you find is if it's published first in England, then they'll just reprint it. And if they can get hold of the originals from over here, they'll actually just set the whole thing from the British set, but they might change the end papers and they might certainly not change the covers and that. If it's published in America first, they will edit it so that all the spellings like colour is C-L-O-R instead of C-L-O-U-R, and they'll do all that, and then they'll do it. And then when it's published over here, they'll probably retain all those spellings the way they've done it that way. Where I do make a conscious effort with it is if I'm writing as I do occasionally, not very often, if I write a short story and it's a modern horror story. If it's obviously going to be set in the States or have an American influence, as some of my stories do, then I just try to write it as if, it's, well, we can try and slightly change the language or whatever. But otherwise, I don't think it matters. I think what looks ghastly when you're reading it is if you're reading a fantasy novel set in an alternative world, when they're all saying Juju and all this. I hope that as an English writer you don't put the equivalent of gosh and all this stuff in there as well, But I think it grates quite a lot if you do that. So I suppose I try to avoid that, conscious of it, but you can probably get away with a bit more in fantasy.
Interesting to see Branagh saying, flipping heck, what's that?
Yeah, somebody tore me off a strip for actually swearing in one of the Omar. One of the characters swore. I forget what he said. I think he actually called somebody a bastard or something. And they said no, they felt that it was totally out of context with the way those people spoke. I said, well, I was only just trying to get over the fact that he lost his temper and, But they said, well, yeah, the book was fine, but that just grated a bit. So. You never know how things are going to react.
You want to pray? Go on.
What do you prefer writing, short stories or novels?
Novels, actually. I find short stories very difficult. It's a totally different medium. It must be as different as using oils after watercolours, I think. I've had the opportunity over the last few years, as I've been getting established, to write short fiction, because what seems to happen to a lot of writers, where there's a collection coming out of, say, horror stories, which are now, anthologies are becoming quite popular again. Often you'll get an editor will write to you, or you might meet them at a convention or something, and they'll say, well, I'm doing a collection of stories, I'd be interested in seeing one from you. And I had an opportunity a couple of years or so ago for writing a story for the new version of Pan Book of Horrors. It's been a favourite of mine. Most people that read fantasy, if you've been around for a few years, you've probably started off reading the first Pan Book of Horrors story. Don't look a long way into it. But it's been revamped it's now called Dark Voices, and a couple of friends of mine edited it, and they for the first one they did the best of the 30 years of Pan Horror. Dark Voices, a big massive omnibus, which was a super collection, and said, right, we want new manuscripts for Dark Voices 2, which will be all new stories, and we'd like to see one from them. I thought, well, it's an opportunity, I mustn't miss it unless I can possibly help it. I really want to try and do something. And my previous efforts at short stories had all been done in the days when I had a typewriter. So this was going to be my first effort at writing a short story on a word processor. I've been writing novels on a word processor. And I started writing. Well, the trouble I have with short stories is, as I said earlier, I paint on a broad canvas. My short stories start to, they spread out, and by the time you've got past page 30 and you realise you're only about a third of the way through the story, there's no novel anymore. And sure enough, this was happening with this story that I was trying to write. And I sort of let it go for a day or two, and I went back to it. And because it was on the word processor, I was doing it over, I did about 8 drafts of it, and finally beat it into what I thought was a reasonable shape. And fortunately, it was one of the ones that they chose for the anthology. But it had been a real hard slog, and I've done a few since, some of which I've sold, some of which I haven't. I think I just need to go through the 5, 6, 7 versions to actually get them done. There are lots of ideas I've got. I'd like to write sort of various modern day macabre stories. I love stories about human emotions and fears. I was quite peeved. I wrote a short story about a guy who's terrified of driving. I don't drive. I mean, I spent a period last year, about a year, trying to learn to drive, about the 5th time, and failed about 3 or 4 tests. And I just got this mental block about it. So I thought, well, I'll write a story. I'll write it out of my system. So I wrote this horror story about a guy. And every time he gets into a car, there's something behind him that he can't see, and it's something horrible, dark, and he can't see it. Nobody else is aware of it, but every time he gets behind the wheel, when he starts the engine, it gets really bad. And the story was about this guy had a good job, but he was being relocated in a different part of the country and was going to have to learn to drive in order to survive. So they would pay for him all the rest of it, but he starts going through the process of having lessons and all the rest of it, but this presence is living all the time. And I wrote this story, I sold it to a magazine called Skeleton Crew, but that's one of the other things that seems to happen to me a lot in life. Skeleton Crew went bust. One issue, the issue, weeks, but this thing was at the printers ready to go, and the only reason that it didn't get published earlier was because he was waiting for an interview that I'd done with somebody to actually go with the short story. So that one's still doing the rounds. I've got other people I'm trying to sell it to. But it seems to be, I have to put a lot of time and effort into a short story, and I don't find it easy. Novels is not easy by any means, because they take a lot of planning, but I don't mind spending, if I'm spending a year on a 400-page book, I feel like I've got more of my time.
As a follow-up, would you consider writing in a franchised universe, something like Robert Aspinall's
Thieves'
World or Abby Niven's No Space?
I might, but I was approached by Warhammer or Games Workshop. They sent me this huge box. They said, "We'll send you some stuff in the post," because they asked if I was interested. I said, "Yeah, okay." And so we'll send you some stuff in the post. And I got home from work one day, and there was this huge box. My 2 kids waiting to pounce, "Please open this box," And there were the Space Hulk games, and this is massive books, magazines, and all the rest of it. And it was obviously they put a lot of thought into this world. It seems to me to be a combination of Dune, 2001, Lord of the Rings, Freddy, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, anything, almost any song, anything, they're all in there. Which I thought was quite fun, you see. So I did my draft, and I'd just written the Bulgarian, the spoof, which I was due to do a month later, and which sends up, in particular, the idea of dwarves in fantasy. There were no dwarves in the Bulgarian, and they didn't exist in that. But I had to write a sword and sorcery story about dwarves, and it was quite good fun. And I wanted to kill the dwarf property and the main dwarf property and defeat them all. But the problem that I had with it was I did a couple of drafts and it seemed all right. It came back and they wanted some revisions, and I created this wonderful amorphous monster which I thought would look really good in their world, but no, they didn't want anything new. They had all their monsters and all the things. They didn't want me to put something fresh in. Just stick to the rules, Adrian. We give you the books. Right. So I rewrote it and got rid of that wonderful creature, and then they said, well, that's fine now. Now the fight at the end, this particular chaos character, well, that's not quite the way, So I rewrote that, and I did about 8 drafts of this thing in the end, and I was really feeling that I'd written the equivalent of about 3 novels, They took it, and it's due to come out next year, I think. And then they wanted me to do 25, 30,000, 40,000 AD, and that's the one with all the Starship Troopers with their Texas chainsaws and all this stuff. You know, it's wonderful. So I thought it'll be fun, and I did a draft. I thought, well, I won't write it if they want a long one. I'll do a synopsis, and that went through about 3 writes. And in the end, I decided that I hadn't got the time to do it. I just couldn't stick. It was too rigid control. You know. I've got friends in the business who write for them and have a lot of fun. They say, well, you know, we can always bang one of those out, but they obviously stick strictly to the rules. But I just can't. I think it'd be difficult to, unless I was given a certain amount of free rein, I would find it very hard to conform to somebody else's.
Even the sort of the nice easy money,
Well, that was the cherry that they held up, you know. Years ago, I was talking earlier about writing for a nameless magazine. I actually used to write for Penthouse magazine, but I wrote. The editor there, the British editors wanted science fiction and horror. It's actually, you know, I wrote a story which I submitted to Omni, which had just started, and they said, well, we don't want it for Omni, but we're trying to do things with Penthouse. It was a science fiction story, or a fantasy story, and they bought it. Penthouse bought it, and the editors used to ask me every now and again for fantasy and horror, which was great. But then the main editor said after a year or two, well, I don't want to carry on like this. You know, you guys in Britain, I don't know what you're doing. You know, we want more of this cheesecake and everything. So they offered me the opportunity to write soft porn for them, and I turned it down. I didn't want to do it, but it was really good money. It was at the time. It was very, very, very top rates. But I think if I'd gone into that, I don't know where I'd have ended up. I might have been getting a lot of money out of it, but not really writing what I wanted to write.
Yeah.
So.
There's a lot of point.
I mean, I'm not saying I'm not mercenary. I mean, with the right kind of money, there's certain things I'd do, I suppose. But no, I mean, you know, if you think you're going to get trapped into something, it's not really what you want to do, is it? I think it's worth it.
Any more questions? Alan?
How do you decide on the titles for your stories or books? Or do you get told what to call them by the publisher?
No, I've sometimes it just pops out. It's the first thing that comes to you. I think A Place Among the Fallen was a title I had before I started writing the book. I wasn't thinking about it. Other times it's a nightmare. You can't get a title. You know, you sort of wrestle around with it. The worst problem I had was with the third of the O'Maran books. I got the first title and I got the second title without any trouble at all, really. But that one just didn't seem to. Nothing would work. And I remember coming back from London on a coach. I'd been to, I think it must be a convention or seeing the publisher. And it's something like a 5-hour journey to the remote part of the world where I live. I spent the entire 5 hours trying to think of the title of this book, and I came up with about 3 or 4, none of which were any good. But I don't know what happened in the end. I think it just came to me one day. I mean, King of Light and Shadow sounded right. After I actually got the book, or the draft cover of it, the proof cover, King of Light and Shadows, I thought I've seen that title before somewhere. But it was probably the closest thing to it was Creatures of Light and Darkness by Roger Zelazny, who was a particular favourite of mine. And whether that was a subconscious thing, I don't know. But otherwise, I try to go for a good title because I think that you shouldn't throw away a title any more than you should a name of a character. I think it's very important. It's the first thing that strikes you, and you like to try and get a good ring to it. So if I'm not, I mean, sometimes I haven't got a decent title, but I mean, I don't let that hold me up. You know, I think, well, okay, well, I'll think about the title later, and maybe something will come to me when I'm writing the book. And the same with characters. You know, if you ever see any of my first drafts, not quite so much now that I do them on a word processor, but I always used to sort of rattle off my rough draft on the old manual typewriter. And there are lots of Freds and Berts and all the rest of it in there because I just couldn't be bothered to think of the name at the time. But then I would go back and think carefully now, how can I try and get a name which sounds right for this character? So, yeah, that's very important.
Question over here? No?
Who's going to leave the room?
Fiona?
Do you think that in the fantasy market that there's still the tendency towards a certain amount of soft porn? mostly, it's sometimes in books, but certainly in films.
Yes, I think so. I think that sex and violence, are exploited and will always be exploited. And as long as there is a market for it, it will continue to be exploited, unless there's a real serious lobby to stop it. I haven't read as much fantasy lately as I used to do. And there doesn't seem to be, I don't know whether there's quite so much in what I've read in fantasy, but certainly in horror. I mean, horror fiction now seems to be, under the excuse of pushing on to new intellectual limits, it's actually really trying to titillate audiences with being as overtly nasty and as overtly, well, I suppose it's pornography. I mean, violence towards women I think it's a big problem in fiction and in movies, and I think that I don't think we've gone anywhere near really addressing it as a problem. I'm not sure what actual problems it causes for people, but I mean, I do think that. I don't know. I'm a bit of a reactionary in that I do believe in censorship, and I don't believe that we should discard censorship altogether. And a lot of my colleagues, especially in horror, think that I'm a bit of an old fuddy-duddy in that respect. But I mean, I do see things, and I really can't see any justification for them. I mean, I couldn't justify certain things that I see on some of these movies. I mean, okay, everyone's got the right to choose what they watch, but I think that we are becoming generally desensitised to a lot of sex and violence, and I don't know that that's healthy. I mean, my gut feeling is that it isn't. But I tend to get shouted down when I say that sort of thing. But I will continue to say that.
Good. So you'd rather see horror, well, a more psychological type of horror, more Hitchcockian and less pecking-part?
Well, I think you can. What I don't like is where horror is used purely and simply as a means of titillation, as a means of look. This is fun because it's really horrible. Where there is the plot, character, human sensitivity is all thrown out of the window. The assumption that women like to be chased and attacked by these lunatics, the attitudes that filmmakers adopt in portraying the way, in particular, women feel about things is wrong. I mean, that's what I'm opposed to, and making use of that, exploiting that, purely for its own sake. I'm very fond of the best works of Clive Barker, which are very graphic, and I quite like the Hellraiser and Hellbound movies, although I think that they're very flawed in some ways, because that sort of fiction and film will always tread the line of being. There's always a danger that you can intellectualize it and actually you're making an excuse for doing something completely different. So it's a tightrope area. So
we're never going to get any chainmail bikinis from you either then?
Well, probably it'd be tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
I mean, I would use it in a different way if I was going to do it.
Good. I think I speak for most of our women readers.
Yeah, just to come back on that, me and Simon did a bit of a survey some months ago of horror movies on video, and you could always tell which woman was going to get killed first because she took her clothes off. You have the group of young people, the young teenagers go to the house, the camp, whatever, and the first person to get killed is the woman who takes her clothes off first.
Yeah, I saw a thing on magazine.
She goes to bed with one of the guys and that's it. She's dog meter.
Yeah, using it as a kind of reactionary, moral.
I mean, this is some sort of radical genetic
Well, it's very worrying.
engineering.
Yeah, I mean, very worrying. Yes, I mean.
The one hits it shortly afterwards.
There are more questions. One last one. What's next? You've done Blood Red Angel, I assume that apart from revisions, you seem more or less finished with that one.
Yeah.
Have you got anything in the pipeline?
Yeah, I'm about, well, I've been working sort of on notes in general think tank about new novel, and I'm starting it. It's called, well, the working title is Heart of the Beast. But it is actually a horror novel, mainly. It's set in our world, and it's set in a combination. Part of it's set in Devon, and part of it's set in London. But it's also linked in with a parallel world, which is like our world in many ways, but it's slightly darker, which is a theme I've used before, as a theme that I used in Moorstones, for an obvious example. And again, it's got the fusion, the elements of fantasy and perhaps science fiction and horror linked in, although, as I say, it's probably more towards horror because it's set in our own world. The dilemma I'll have with it, I suppose, is that there will be some fairly strong violence in it, or there will be potential for being violent, so I have to deal with that in my own way. I don't know how I'll deal with that. Cross each bridge when I come to it. But it'll probably take me about a year to do it, to get the draft ready. But I feel that I need to keep stretching. I mean, I can't settle down and just write formula fiction. It would be very easy just to sort of produce the idea for another quartet and fall into the trap now of just turning out, you know. And I don't know.
A lot of them do.
I don't think I can do that. You know, very hard to do that. So this would be something. I'm going to set myself a bit of a challenge as well. Certainly did that with Blood Red Angel, which was very hard to write. There's a very, very dark fantasy there.
Are there any more questions from the floor? Well, I think we've worked Adrian quite hard enough actually this afternoon. Thank you, Adrian.